Let me ask, what was the best sermon you've ever heard? And if it wasn't me that preached it, do you remember who it was that preached that sermon? Do you remember what the topic was that they talked about, or maybe what the outline was? Was there a particular story or illustration that just spoke to you? Did it change the way that you think about something, or have any lasting impact on your life? Was it maybe the sermon that first led you to put your faith in Christ? I'm sure if you ask those questions to any of the myriad listeners gathered around the Galilean hillside 20 centuries ago, every one of them would have told you that Jesus' sermon, the one that we now refer to as the Sermon on the Mount, was easily the most meaningful sermon they had ever heard. The Bible says that the crowd was amazed by the teachings of Jesus. And it's no wonder. Jesus taught with such authority and authenticity that, the likes of which had never been seen or heard before. And the Sermon on the Mount contains some of the most profound and prolific teachings you'll find anywhere in the Bible. Christ's words were encouraging, educational, exhorting, and even entertaining. And most importantly, when we hear them and we apply them to our lives, the teachings of Jesus provide a strong and sturdy foundation for us to build our lives upon. Now, last Sunday, I began this study of the Sermon on the Mount, and we looked at the opening section of Jesus' sermon, which is usually titled the Beatitudes. And the word beatitude, if you'll remember, just means, it's a Latin word that means supremely blessed. And so this opening section is just this amazing series of blessings. Jesus says, blessed are the, and then he fills in the blank with a variety of different characteristics and consequences, all of which create this picture of ultimate contentment. The Beatitudes are in many ways a compliment, but they're also a challenge to Christ's followers. And the same can be said for this next section of Christ's sermon. If you have a Bible or an app on your phone or other device, feel free to follow along as I read these next few verses. This is from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. Jesus says there, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Now, I'm sure that many, if not all of you, are at least somewhat familiar with these verses. Jesus has a knack for creating powerful images that lodge in people's minds. And this passage about salt and light is no exception. It's so memorable once you hear it. Just the phrase, the salt of the earth, is used almost every day by somebody we meet. And this imagery of salt and light, these are two of the most common elements on earth. Go anywhere in the world and you'll find salt and light. They were just as common in Jesus' day as they are today. As a boy, Jesus would have watched his mother salting the meat before the evening meal, and each night he would have watched her lighting her little lamps all throughout the house. As ordinary as they are, however, Jesus used these images to give Christians one of their greatest compliments and to set forth one of their greatest challenges. And this is one of the most powerful passages on the Bible about a Christian's influence in the world. Salt and light were and still are both tremendously important. They are essential for life. Our bodies require salt to function, and life can't exist without light. If the sun were suddenly extinguished, nearly all life on earth would vanish. When Jesus said that his followers were salt and light, he was saying that they are extremely important. In fact, his purposes cannot be accomplished without us. So let's take a closer look at these two elements to see if we can understand the significance of this imagery, starting with salt. In fact, I'm going to give you, if you take notes, I actually have like 2 mini sermons built into this one sermon. So there's like a 3-point outline on salt and a 3-point outline on light. We're going to start with salt. When Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth," his words were, like I said, first of all, a compliment. Salt was highly valued in Jesus' day. In fact, it was often used as currency. The Romans used to frequently pay their soldiers in salt, and that's where the saying, "that guy isn't worth his salt," comes from. You know, it was another way of saying that guy's not worth what we pay him. We should cut his salary. He's not doing his job. That guy isn't worth his salt. And so what was it that made salt so valuable in the first century? Well, 2 things primarily. First, salt made food palatable. It made food taste better, in other words. In Jesus' day, just like today, one of the primary uses of salt was to flavor food. In fact, in the Old Testament, Job actually says, this is Job 6, verse 6, he says, "Tasteless food is not eaten without salt, and there is no flavor in the white of an egg." So I guess that means the next time somebody serves you eggs without salt, you can say, "That's not biblical." Job says not to eat it without salt. And I don't know about you, but I'm like that. I put salt on everything. In fact, it drives Ashley crazy, because she's the cook in our house, and she loves to cook, and she's a very good cook. She makes all these fantastic meals for us, but before I even taste it, I will start pouring salt on it. You know, I just grab the salt shaker. If I can't see the salt on top, it obviously needs more salt. That's just the way I add salt to McDonald's French fries. That's how much salt I like on my food. And I can't help it. That's just the way that I am. I kind of crave it. And I know people who have to live on a low sodium or a salt-free diet, they kind of struggle sometimes to improve the flavor of food without adding salt. And I know your taste buds kind of adjust over time. You know, if you cut back on salt more and more, then you stop missing it so much. But nothing makes food more palatable than simply just adding a dash of salt. So when Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth," what does that say about the earth? It says that apart from Christians living their lives for Jesus, the earth is pretty bland. You know, in the long run, everything that this world has to offer ends up tasteless. On the contrary, what it says about Christians is that we add flavor to this world. We make the world taste better to the one who created it, to the cook. And that's quite a compliment. But that's not all. In addition to making food palatable, salt is also used for a preservative. Salt preserves food. And this is probably the most important use of salt in biblical times, and what gave it its great value. In those days, you couldn't run to the appliance store and buy a refrigerator or a freezer to keep meat cold and fresh. Meat spoiled very quickly, so in order to preserve the meat for as long as possible, they rubbed salt into it. Fishermen actually packed their fish, while they're pulling them up out of the lake and putting them into little boxes that they had on their boats. They were packed in salt in order to preserve them and keep them from spoiling. Salt preserves, and you, Jesus says, are the salt of the earth. So what does that say about the earth? It says that the earth is decaying, spoiling, it's going bad. And just look at the declining moral standards of the world, the shortage of honesty and integrity, the lack of interest in spiritual matters. It's not hard to see what Jesus meant by this. The world is kind of like fish being pulled from the sea. If it's not packed in salt, it's going to spoil quickly. In contrast, it tells us that Christians have to be a preservative. A small amount of salt can preserve a large piece of meat, and likewise, a few dedicated Christians can preserve the moral and spiritual fabric of a society. Do you remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah from the Old Testament? God went to Abraham and told Abraham that all the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah were wicked and that he planned on destroying both of those two cities. And Abraham just kind of brazenly said, wait, God, are you sure you want to do that? He said, what if there are 50 righteous people in those cities? Wouldn't you spare the city for 50 righteous people? And God said, well, of course I'd spare the city for 50 righteous people. And so Abraham said, well, how about 40? Or how about 30? How about 20? How about 10? He got down to 10 righteous people. And God said, of course, if there are 10 righteous people, I would spare both cities. 2 cities would be saved if there were just 10 righteous people in them. See, just a handful of people living their lives for Christ can really preserve a community, a city, and a country. By calling his followers salt of the earth, Jesus placed a high value on them. But there's a challenge associated with this compliment. And the challenge is for salt to remain pure. Salt has to stay pure. Now, after calling his followers the salt of the earth, Jesus says something seemingly nonsensical. He says in verse 13, "But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." Now, actual salt is an incredibly stable chemical compound, sodium chloride, and it doesn't lose its saltiness. It never changes, basically. Salt is salt. It doesn't change over time. It doesn't lose its saltiness. You can store it in a cupboard for 100 years, and a century later, when you take it out, it would still be the same as it was when you put it in. So what is Jesus talking about? Well, in his day, the best and purest salt was acquired by evaporating water from the sea. They would get salt water, and they evaporate the water, and then what's left is just the salt. But most of the salt in his region wasn't acquired that way. In fact, it was acquired by mining it from mineral deposits found in salt marshes and along the shore of the Dead Sea, which was a saltwater lake. And these mineral deposits did contain salt, but they also contained other chemicals and minerals as well, and it was hard to distinguish between the two. So if this salty mixture was then passed off as salt, oftentimes the percentage of actual salt in it would be reduced over time. And if, when they would mine these out, they would pile them up. If it happened to rain after they piled up these big mineral deposits, then the sodium chloride, which was very soluble, would wash away, and you'd be left with this crystalline structure that still looked like salt, but it didn't taste anything like salt. It was literally good for nothing. In fact, they would smash it up and they would sprinkle it on their rooftops in order to add traction, because they entertained on their rooftops. And so they would use it to walk on, literally trampling it underfoot. So Jesus is saying that this same thing can happen to Christians. In other words, it's possible to have the appearance of salt, but have all the salt that's actually in you washed away. If we allow the world to wash away everything that's good and godly about us, then we're no longer able to make the world more palatable or preserve it. Only when we live the kind of life that Jesus describes in the Beatitudes can we make an impact on the world for Christ's sake. In short, Jesus' message to Christians is stay salty. Stay salty. Of course, salt is just the first of the two images. Next, Jesus compares Christians to light. He says in verse 14, "You are the light of the world." And just as with salt, the imagery here is both a compliment and a challenge. We see this in the characteristics of light that Jesus alludes to. First, he says that light provides direction. Light provides direction. A light in the distance shows us which way to go. And that's what Jesus is alluding to when he says in verse 14, "A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." See, in ancient times, cities and towns were often built on hilltops and mountains. So for two reasons. One was so that they could see enemies approaching from just about every direction. They could look down and see anybody on their way. And the other was to, avoid using valuable farmland. Farmland needed flat land, and so cities and towns were built on hilltops, which couldn't be used for farmland. A side effect of building the city on hilltops, though, was that the glow from the many torches and lanterns could be seen from miles away. A traveler journeying through this desert wasteland could always tell when they were coming upon a city. There it was, just sitting on the hill like a guiding light, providing them direction. Just as lighthouses guide ships to safe harbor, a city set on a hill guided travelers to safety. And that reminds me of one of my favorite hymns titled, "Let the Lower Lights Be Burning." It's a song with a story behind it. Dwight L. Moody, who was a famous preacher in Chicago, was preaching when he told the story of a violent storm on Lake Erie. It was a dark and stormy night, Moody recalled, when the waves were rolling like mountains and that not a star could be seen, and a boat neared the Cleveland harbor, rocking and plunging in the waves. The captain and the pilot were able to see the light from the lighthouse, but the lower lights that were all lit up along the shore had all gone out. They didn't really have any other options, though, so with a strong hand and a brave heart, the old pilot guided the boat. But in the darkness, he missed the channel and he crashed into the rocks. The boat was slivered and the entire crew lost their lives. Sitting in the pew, listening as Moody relayed this story, was a composer named Philip Bliss. And inspired by that true story, Philip wrote the enduring hymn, "Let the Lower Lights Be Burning." The opening stanza proclaims, "Brightly beams our Father's mercy from his lighthouse evermore, but to us he gives the keeping of the lights along the shore." See, Jesus may be the everlasting light, but we're no less the light of the world, the lower lights guiding people to Jesus, guiding them to safety. And that's what Jesus says his followers are to the world, a beacon, a lighthouse, a city aglow on a hilltop, directing people to him. Furthermore, light also provides discernment. So it gives us direction, but it also gives us discernment. And Jesus hints at this in the next verse when he says in verse 15, "No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house." And again, before electricity, people used lamps and lanterns to light their house. And they would place these lamps on lamp stands. Now, sometimes it would just be a niche carved into the wall that they would put the lantern on, or sometimes it would just be a wood or metal shelf. But they would place it somewhere high in the house so that it could give light to everybody in the room. And that was important because, in a place like that with no street lights, no electricity of any kind, it got really dark at night. And so if you were going to be out of bed doing anything in the dark, you're going to be banging your shins and stumbling over things unless you had that light to allow you to see. Similar to the way a city set on a hill helps people to see what's in the distance, a lamp helped people to see what's right in front of them. And these two functions of light are similar, but here's the difference, at least as it relates to Christians. We are like a city set on a hill when people see us from a distance. Maybe they don't know you personally, they don't know a whole lot about you, but they see that you're a Christian, they know you go to church, maybe they've seen how you live your life. Christians are like a lamp on a lampstand when we actually interact with people. Through conversations and a Christ-like spirit, we can help people see what's right in front of them. We can lead them to know God or to put their faith in Jesus or to understand the Bible. That's how we are both a city set on a hill and a lamp set on a lampstand. The challenge, however, is to make sure we display our light. And that's the last part of this one. A light must be displayed. Jesus said that a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. And he said that you don't, light your lamp and then put a bowl or a basket over top of it. That would be ridiculous. He concludes then in verse 16, in the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. We live in a dark world. And sometimes it feels like it's getting darker by the day. Elsewhere, Jesus said, this is from John chapter 3, verse 19. He said, God's light came into the world, but people loved the darkness more than the light, for their actions were evil. And I see the truth of this verse more and more in our country and in our culture. I admit that it discourages me at times. I look just this week. We received news that New York passed a law allowing abortions all the way up to the date of the baby's birth. Illinois passed a law funding abortions with taxpayer money. And news like that just reminds me of how dark our world can be at times. And the moral and spiritual darkness grows so thick at times that I feel like giving up. But it's times like that that we have to remember that light has no purpose if there's no darkness. The purpose of light is to dispel the darkness. That's why God put us here. And the blacker the darkness, the brighter the light appears. Have you ever noticed that? Like a single light in a very dark place shines much brighter than it would under other circumstances. I see that. I noticed it just last night. We forgot to put the dog away. We always keep him in the laundry room at night while the rest of us are sleeping. Well, he was sleeping in the hallway outside our door, and then our daughter walked and came into our room and opened our door, and then she went back to bed. And so around 2:30 in the morning, I hear my dog licking himself at the foot of my bed. And I'm like, okay, so you need to go back where you belong. I got up, and I was able to walk all the way through the house and put him back in the laundry room and come back to my room without turning any lights on. And the reason for that is because all throughout our house, we have tiny little lights. You know, like the DVD player or the Xbox or the TV or our phones plugged into the charger or, you know, all these little devices and electronics all over the house, the digital clock on the stove, all emit a tiny little light. It's usually just a little soft blue glow or maybe a soft green glow. And during the day, you can't even see them. I mean, when the lights are on and it's bright all throughout the house, those aren't even noticeable. But when all the lights are out and it's completely dark, those lights seem to shine so much brighter. And in the middle of the night, I can walk from one end of my house to the other just by the light of those tiny, soft, glowing devices all throughout our house. And the same is true for Christians. If we live good and godly lives, our lights will shine in the darkness, brighter than we think they will, pointing people to God. The darker our world gets, the brighter our lights will shine. And that's why it's so important for us to display our lights. Don't hide your faith or your relationship with God. You know, like the song says, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, shine, shine all the time. That's what we need to do. Salt and light are powerful pictures of Christians' influence and importance. When Jesus calls his followers the salt of the earth and the light of the world, those words carried monumental meaning. Like salt, genuine followers of Christ make the world more palatable. They act as a preservative, but we have to be careful to stay pure, not allowing our effectiveness to be diluted by outside influences. And like light, genuine followers of Christ provide direction and discernment to seekers trying to find their way to God. But again, we have to be careful to display our lights and not hide them for fear of rejection or ridicule. We need to let our light shine. Next week, I hope you'll join me as we continue digging into Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. But in the meantime, I want to challenge you to be salt and light in your world. You know, at home with your family, at the workplace, in the community. Sprinkle your salt and shine your light so that others will be drawn to Christ. And if you have any questions about what that means and how to live that out in your daily life, I'd love to talk with you about it. You can come forward now, or you can pull me aside after church, or you can just call me at home sometime during the week. Let's stand and sing together, church.